The alarm started before the priest finished his final line. I remember gripping the edge of the altar as the sound tore through the great hall, red light washing over every face in the room. 300 guests, 2 empires, 1 wedding that was supposed to end a war. And in the middle of it, sirens screaming that something was approaching our border. My name is Kira Vantel, and on the day I married a human, I was more afraid of him than of the enemy ships closing in on our colony. My father, Governor Owen Pierce, did not even flinch. He simply raised a hand, and the guards at the doors straightened, waiting for his order. This was supposed to be the proudest day of his political career, the day he sealed peace between the Velkari Dominion and the human worlds with a single marriage. Instead, it looked like it might become the day everything fell apart in front of every camera in the galaxy. I turned to look at the man standing beside me, Daniel Hart, my husband, as of 30 seconds ago. He did not turn to look at the doors. He did not reach for a weapon. He looked at me first, like the alarms were background noise and I was the only thing worth paying attention to. "They're just scouts," he said quietly. "They won't cross the line." I did not know how he could be so certain. I did not know, yet, that he was almost never wrong about things like this. I had spent months dreading this wedding, not because Daniel was cruel, or ugly, or unkind. He was none of those things. I dreaded it because he was human, and everyone in my family, in my empire, in every history lesson I had ever sat through, had taught me exactly what that meant. Humans were young, reckless, their bodies broke easily, their lives ended quickly, and their military tactics, according to every officer I had ever spoken to, were built on desperation rather than skill. My people had fought 2 wars with human colonies at the edges of our territory, and both times we assumed we understood our enemy. Both times we were wrong in ways nobody wanted to admit out loud. The peace treaty that ended the Second War was strange from the beginning. Human diplomats did not ask for land. They did not ask for resources, or ships, or any of the usual demands that came after a conflict like ours. They asked for one thing only, a marriage, between their soldier, Daniel Hart, and a daughter of the Velkari ruling family. At the time, I thought it was an insult, a show of dominance, disguised as diplomacy. My father thought it was an opportunity, a way to keep a human close enough to study, close enough to control. I was the one who had to live with the outcome, so of course nobody asked what I thought. I agreed anyway. Not because I wanted to, because refusing meant the war would continue, and I had already lost enough people I loved to pretend that pride mattered more than peace. So there I stood, 30 seconds into my marriage, watching red light flash across my husband's calm face while enemy ships crept toward the edge of our territory. "How do you know they won't cross the line?" I asked him, keeping my voice low enough that only he could hear it. He glanced toward the doors for the first time since the alarm started, just once, just long enough to read something I could not see. "Because, if they were serious," he said, "the alarm would already be different." I did not understand what he meant, not then. I only understood, weeks later, that Daniel Hart could read the difference between a real attack and a message meant to intimidate simply by the pattern of a siren most people in that hall could not even process. The ceremony ended in confusion rather than celebration. Guards escorted guests out through side corridors while officers rushed toward the command center. My father barked orders at 3 different aides at once, his composed politician's mask cracking just slightly at the edges. I watched him disappear down the hall toward the war room, already forgetting that his daughter had just been married in the middle of a crisis. Daniel did not follow him. He stayed beside me, offering his arm as if we were still walking down an aisle instead of being evacuated from a hall that might become a target. "You're not worried," I said. It was not a question. "I'm not worried about the scouts," he answered. "I'm worried about you standing here in a dress that makes it hard for you to run if you need to." I laughed before I could stop myself. It surprised me, that sound coming out of my own throat in the middle of an emergency. Nothing about my wedding day had gone the way I expected, And somehow, the strangest part was that my new husband's first concern was not the enemy ships, not the political disaster, not even his own safety. It was mine. We were taken to a secure wing of the palace, away from windows, away from anything that could be seen from orbit. I sat on a low bench while soldiers moved past us, carrying equipment I did not recognize, human equipment, brought along with Daniel as part of the marriage agreement. Nobody had explained to me exactly what he was allowed to bring with him. Nobody had explained much of anything, actually. I had been handed a treaty document and a wedding date, and expected to accept both without complaint. Daniel sat beside me without asking permission, which should have annoyed me and somehow did not. "You don't trust me," he said, not accusing, just stating something he had clearly already noticed. "I don't know you," I said. "There's a difference." "Fair enough. Fair enough." He nodded slowly, watching a group of Velkhari officers argue over a tactical display a few meters away. What would help? Nobody had ever asked me that question before. Not my father, not my advisors, not the endless string of Velkhari suitors who assumed marrying into power was reward enough for any woman. I did not have an answer ready, so I gave him the only honest thing I had. "Time," I said, "and the truth, whenever you're able to give it." He looked at me for a long moment, longer than politeness required, like he was deciding something important. "I can give you both," he said, "just not all of the truth today." I should have been angry at that. Instead, I found myself oddly comforted by his honesty about his own limits. Every Velkhari official I knew claimed to have nothing to hide while hiding everything. Daniel simply told me there were things he could not share yet, without pretending those things did not exist. The scout ships never crossed the border, exactly as he predicted. By the time the alarms fell silent an hour later, most of the wedding guests had already fled to their transports, certain that Velkhari space was no longer safe. My father returned looking exhausted, his ceremonial robes wrinkled, his expression somewhere between relief and irritation. "A show of strength," he told me later, once we were alone. The Drathan ascendancy wanted to remind everyone they're still watching, nothing more. "And if it had been more?" I asked. He did not answer directly. He simply looked at Daniel, standing quietly near the doorway, and something passed across my father's face that I had never seen there before. Not quite fear, something closer to careful respect, the kind you give something you do not fully understand. That night, alone in the quarters I now shared with a man I had known for exactly one day, I found myself studying him instead of sleeping. He did not snore, did not shift restlessly, did not do any of the small human things I had been told to expect. He slept the way he did everything else, carefully, like even rest was something he approached with discipline. I thought about the scar along his forearm, thin and pale, unlike any wound I recognized from Velkhari or Drathan weapons. I thought about the way soldiers twice his size had stepped aside for him without being ordered to, back at the wedding, before any of us knew who he really was to them. I thought about the calm in his voice when he told me the scout ships would not cross the line, and how right he had been. I told myself I was simply cautious. That any reasonable person newly married to a stranger from another species would study him this closely, searching for reasons to trust or distrust the person now sharing their life. I told myself this was ordinary wariness, nothing more. But somewhere beneath that reasonable explanation, a smaller, quieter thought had already taken root. A thought I was not ready to examine yet. I had been given a husband to keep the peace, and some instinct I could not name was already whispering that peace was not the only thing Daniel Hart had been sent here to protect. I did not know, that first night, how right that instinct would turn out to be. I only knew that I had married a man my empire believed we understood, and within a single day I had already seen enough to doubt that belief completely. Somewhere beyond our borders, the Drathan ascendancy was watching too. They had sent their scouts as a message, a way of testing how far peace could bend before it broke. They did not yet know what would happen the day they finally pushed too far. Neither did I. Not completely, not yet. But lying awake that night, listening to my new husband breathe in the careful, measured way he did everything, I understood one thing clearly for the first time. Whatever peace this marriage was supposed to protect, it was going to cost far more than either empire had bargained for, and I had a feeling, deep and uneasy, that I was the only one close enough to see it coming. The weeks that followed our wedding taught me more about my husband than any briefing document ever could have. I had been assigned, quietly, to observe him. My father never said it directly, but the request was clear enough between the lines of our conversations. Learn what you can, report what matters. I told myself I was simply doing my duty as a daughter of the Velkari Dominion, gathering information that might protect my people. I did not admit, even to myself, how much of my attention had stopped feeling like duty and started feeling like curiosity. Daniel worked closely with the colony's defense forces, training local militia units who had never faced a real conflict before. I watched him from the observation deck above the training yard more often than I meant to, telling myself each time that it was research. He never raised his voice. He never mocked a soldier for a mistake. He simply repeated instructions with the same patience each time, adjusting a stance here, correcting a grip there, until movements that looked clumsy in the morning became sharp and controlled by evening. One afternoon, a young Velkari recruit named Torin Ashby lost his temper during a drill, throwing his training weapon to the ground and shouting that the exercises were pointless against an enemy who would never fight fair. Daniel did not raise his voice to match him. He simply crouched down, picked up the weapon, and handed it back. "You're right," Daniel said. "They won't fight fair. That's exactly why we train like this." Something about the calm certainty in his voice settled the young recruit faster than any punishment could have. I found myself thinking about that exchange long after I should have moved on to other observations. It was a smaller incident, weeks later, that truly changed how I saw him. A trading dispute in the lower district turned violent when armed smugglers took hostages inside a supply depot, demanding safe passage off the colony in exchange for the workers they held. Velkari security forces surrounded the building within minutes, but negotiations stalled quickly. The smugglers were desperate, unpredictable, and the workers inside had families gathering outside the perimeter, crying out for someone to do something before the situation turned fatal. I was there that day, not by accident. I had followed reports of the standoff, drawn by concern for the colony rather than any personal interest in Daniel specifically, or so I told myself at the time. I arrived to find him already speaking quietly with the security commander, asking questions about the layout of the depot, the number of hostages, the mental state of the men holding them. "Let me talk to them," he said. The commander hesitated. Velkari protocol did not typically involve unarmed negotiation with hostile parties, especially not from a foreign spouse with no official authority in our security structure. But something in Daniel's tone made the commander step aside anyway. I watched from behind a barricade as Daniel walked toward the depot alone, hands visible, posture relaxed rather than threatening. I could not hear what he said through the comm system, but I watched the tension in the standoff shift slowly, minute by minute, as he spoke. No weapons were drawn, no shots were fired. 20 minutes later, the depot doors opened, and the workers walked out unharmed, followed eventually by the smugglers themselves, disarmed and calm, agreeing to a peaceful surrender that nobody expected to happen without violence. I asked him about it that evening, unable to hold back my questions any longer. "How did you know they would listen to you?" I asked. "I didn't know," he said. "I just gave them a way out that let them keep some dignity. Most people who do desperate things aren't looking for a fight. They're looking for an exit that doesn't feel like defeat. And if they hadn't listened..." He paused before answering, choosing his words carefully in a way that told me the honest answer was not something he wanted to share yet. "Then it would have gone differently," he said simply. I let the subject drop that night, but I did not forget the way his expression had shifted, just slightly, when I pushed for more detail, like a door closing gently rather than slamming shut. I was beginning to understand that Daniel Hart had many doors like that, each one hiding something he was not ready to show me. My reports to my father grew shorter over those weeks, not because I had less to say, but because I found myself reluctant to hand over observations that felt increasingly personal rather than strategic. I told myself this was simply professional caution, avoiding conclusions before I had enough evidence. In truth, I was beginning to feel protective of information that belonged to a man I was supposed to be studying as a subject rather than getting to know as a partner. It was during a quiet evening at the Colony Archive, searching for historical records related to previous treaty negotiations, that I stumbled onto something that unsettled me more than any battlefield report could have. I had been searching for information about the Second War between our peoples, hoping to understand the full context behind the marriage agreement that had brought Daniel into my life. Instead, I found a pattern buried in older records, one that no official history seemed eager to highlight. Every faction, empire, or alliance that had broken a treaty with human forces over the past several decades had experienced catastrophic and unexplained losses shortly afterward. A pirate confederation near the outer colonies, wiped out within a single cycle after violating a ceasefire agreement, its main command station destroyed with no surviving witnesses able to describe what happened. A rival Velkari faction, decades before my birth, that had assassinated a human diplomat during a fragile negotiation, only to lose an entire fleet stationed at their primary shipyard within days, the official reports listing the cause only as unknown catastrophic failure. Even a Drathan outpost years earlier that had violated a minor trade agreement with human colonies had reported an entire garrison going silent overnight, with no distress signal ever received. None of the records offered clear explanations. Each incident was filed away separately, treated as an isolated tragedy rather than part of any larger pattern. But reading them together, late at night with Daniel asleep in the next room, I felt a cold understanding settle into my chest that I could not shake. Every faction that had broken peace with humanity had simply stopped existing shortly afterward, quietly, efficiently, without any of the drawn-out warfare that history usually remembered. I closed the archive terminal and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about the calm way Daniel had walked toward armed smugglers without hesitation, the patient way he trained soldiers who would likely never need those skills against him personally, the careful manner in which he chose his words whenever I asked questions that touched too closely on his past. My people had assumed the marriage treaty was a diplomatic gesture, a symbolic gift meant to demonstrate goodwill between two exhausted empires. I was beginning to suspect it was something else entirely, not a gift, a warning, wrapped in the language of peace, delivered in the form of a husband nobody was meant to look at too closely. I did not share this discovery with my father, not yet. I told myself I needed more information before drawing conclusions that could destabilize a fragile peace built on assumptions everyone seemed content to leave unexamined. But that night, when Daniel came looking for me, finding me still sitting alone in the dim light of the archive room, I studied his face differently than I had before, not searching for weakness anymore, searching for the truth hiding just beneath his calm, patient exterior. "You've been quiet," he said, settling into the seat across from me. "Something on your mind?" I considered lying. I considered deflecting the way I had trained myself to do throughout years of political maneuvering within my family's court. Instead, for reasons I could not fully explain even to myself, I chose honesty. "I found some old records tonight," I said carefully, "about what happens to people who break treaties with your kind." Something shifted behind his eyes, brief and quickly controlled, but I caught it anyway. "That's old history," he said. "Is it wrong, though?" He did not answer immediately. He looked at me for a long moment, the silence stretching between us until it felt heavier than any argument could have. "No," he said finally, "it's not wrong. I waited for him to explain further, to offer context, reasoning, anything that might soften the weight of that simple confirmation. He offered nothing else. Just that single, quiet admission, delivered without pride or shame, like a fact he had long since stopped feeling the need to justify. "Why tell me the truth now?" I asked, "when you've avoided it every other time I've asked?" "Because you found it yourself," he said. "And because I think you deserve better than being married to someone who lies to you about what he is." I did not sleep well that night, lying beside a man whose calm presence had once felt comforting and now felt like standing beside something far larger than I had originally understood. I thought about the smugglers who surrendered without a fight, the recruit who calmed down after a single quiet sentence, the scout ships that never crossed the border despite every provocation designed to test our patience. I thought about every faction in those old records that had chosen violence over peace, and how quickly, how completely, they had simply ceased to exist afterward. My empire had married me to a man they believed represented humanity's willingness to compromise. Lying awake beside him that night, I understood for the first time that Daniel Hart was not humanity's compromise at all. He was humanity's alternative, the quiet, patient answer that only appeared when compromise had already failed. And somewhere beyond our borders, an old enemy of ours was preparing to test that answer directly, without any understanding of what they were truly about to provoke. The attack came on an ordinary evening, the kind where nothing about the sky or the streets suggested anything was wrong. I was reviewing trade reports in my office when the first alarm sounded, different from the one that had interrupted my wedding months earlier. This one carried a sharper edge, the kind reserved for confirmed hostile action rather than distant posturing. Within seconds, a second alarm joined it, and then a third, until the sound filled every corridor of the colony administration building. Commander Lily Dane burst through my door without knocking, her expression tighter than I had ever seen it. "Drathan forces have breached the outer perimeter," she said. "They've hit the market district and the eastern residential blocks. They're not just testing us this time." I felt my chest tighten with a fear that had nothing to do with politics or diplomacy. The market district was where families gathered in the evenings. It was where children played while their parents finished their work for the day. It was the last place any reasonable military strategy would target, unless the goal was to cause panic rather than gain territory. "How many hostiles?" I asked, already moving toward the tactical display in the outer room. "Unknown," Lily said. "Their ships dropped out of a hidden approach vector we didn't detect until they were already in orbit. Ground forces deployed within minutes. They're moving fast, and they're taking hostages as they go." I thought immediately of Daniel, and felt a strange mixture of relief and dread when I realized he was not with me at that moment. He had left earlier that day to inspect a supply route near the colony's edge, a routine task that suddenly felt anything but routine given the timing of the attack. "Where is my husband?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. Lily's expression flickered with something I could not quite read. "He should be near the eastern checkpoint," she said, "right in the middle of where they hit hardest." My fear sharpened into something closer to panic, though not the kind Lily seemed to expect. I was not afraid for Daniel's safety in the way I might have once assumed. I was afraid of what would happen to the Drathan soldiers who had chosen, without knowing it, to walk directly into his path. The tactical display filled with red markers within minutes, showing enemy positions spreading across 3 separate districts. Reports came in fragmented and chaotic, security teams calling for reinforcements, civilians requesting evacuation routes, officers demanding clarity that nobody could provide fast enough. Somewhere in the market district, Drathan soldiers had taken control of a public transit station, holding dozens of civilians inside as leverage against any Velkari counterattack. "They want a message sent to the Dominion Council," Lily said, reading from an intercepted communication. "They're claiming the treaty was a sign of weakness. They intend to prove it by showing that human protection means nothing when tested directly." I thought of the old records I had found in the archive weeks earlier. The pattern of factions that had made exactly this mistake before, believing peace was something to be tested rather than respected. I wondered, with a coldness that surprised me, whether the Drathan commanders understood what they were about to learn. For the first 20 minutes after the attack began, communication from the eastern checkpoint remained steady, security teams reporting positions and enemy movements with the practiced efficiency of trained soldiers under pressure. Then, without warning, the reports changed. Eastern checkpoint reporting enemy contact reduced. A voice crackled over the comm system. Repeat, enemy contact reduced. We're seeing Drathan units falling back from position 7 without engaging our forces directly. Lily frowned at the tactical display, tracing the movement with her finger. That doesn't make sense, she muttered. They were advancing 5 minutes ago. 10 minutes later, the reports grew stranger still. Communication from an entire Drathan strike team simply stopped, their position marker on the tactical display frozen in place, while every other unit around them continued reporting normally. No distress signal, no request for reinforcement, just silence, spreading through their ranks like a slow tide. Position 7 has gone dark, an officer reported, confusion clear in his voice. No response to hails. Their last transmission mentioned unusual movement near their flank, then nothing. I found myself standing very still, watching the tactical display with an intensity that had nothing to do with strategic curiosity. I already suspected what was happening, even before anyone else in the room dared to say it aloud. "Where exactly is position 7?" I asked quietly. Lily checked the coordinates, then looked up at me with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and dawning realization. "That's the supply route," she said. "That's where your husband was working today." The silence that followed stretched long enough for the weight of her words to settle fully into the room. Nobody spoke for several seconds, each of us processing the same impossible thought at the same time. More reports followed, each one stranger than the last. A second Drathan unit, positioned nearly a kilometer from the first, reported unusual interference with their equipment moments before losing contact entirely. A third position, guarding the transit station where hostages were being held, suddenly reported an unidentified individual moving through their perimeter without triggering a single alarm. "Command, we have an unauthorized presence inside our security zone," the transmission crackled, the Drathan soldier's voice tight with confusion rather than alarm, requesting immediate identification of. The transmission cut off mid-sentence. I gripped the edge of the tactical console, watching red markers across the display flicker and fade one by one, entire Drathan units simply ceasing to report in, their positions frozen like statues on a map that no longer reflected reality. Civilian hostages, according to the last confirmed reports, remained unharmed throughout the entire encounter, their captors apparently too occupied with a threat they could not identify to focus on the people they had taken. 20 minutes after the silence began, the transit station doors opened from the inside. I was there by then, having moved as close to the scene as security protocols allowed, unable to stay away despite every instinct telling me it was reckless. I watched the hostages walk out first, confused and shaken but entirely unharmed, escorted by Velkari security teams who seemed as bewildered as everyone else about how the situation had resolved so quickly and quietly. Behind them, the Drathan soldiers who had held the station emerged as well, disarmed, subdued, and unusually calm given the circumstances. Not a single visible mark of conflict on any of them, no signs of a firefight, no evidence of the kind of violent confrontation that should have accompanied the collapse of an entire military operation. I searched the crowd for Daniel, my heart racing with a mixture of fear and something I could not quite name. I found him near the edge of the plaza, speaking quietly with a Drathan commander who looked considerably less confident than he likely had at the start of the evening. Daniel's uniform was unwrinkled. His expression was calm, almost gentle, the same expression he wore when training recruits or negotiating with desperate smugglers. Nothing about him suggested he had just single-handedly dismantled an entire military operation across 3 separate districts in under an hour. I approached slowly, watching the way the Drathan commander flinched slightly at my presence, as if my proximity to Daniel carried its own quiet threat now. "It's over," Daniel said simply, turning to face me. "The hostages are safe. Their forces have stood down." "How?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected I would not receive a full answer that night. He glanced at the Drathan commander beside him, then back at me, choosing his words with the same careful precision he always used when the truth felt heavier than he wanted to hand me all at once. "I asked them to reconsider," he said. "Most of them did, once they understood what continuing would actually cost." The Drathan commander said nothing, his eyes fixed on the ground, his posture carrying none of the aggressive confidence I had seen in reports of his forces just an hour earlier. Whatever had happened between him and Daniel during those 20 minutes of silence, it had clearly left an impression far deeper than any physical wound could have. Later that night, once the hostages had been safely returned to their families and the Drathan forces had been quietly escorted back to their own territory under an uneasy truce, I found Daniel alone on the balcony of our quarters, looking out over a colony that had nearly become a battlefield hours earlier. "You're not going to tell me everything, are you?" I said, joining him at the railing. "Not tonight," he admitted. "Some of it, I think you need to see for yourself before I explain it. Some of it, I'm honestly not sure you're ready to hear yet." I studied his profile in the dim evening light, searching for some sign of exhaustion, some indication that the events of the past few hours had cost him something the way they clearly would have cost any Velkhari soldier facing the same odds. I found nothing, just the same quiet calm he always carried, as if dismantling an entire hostile operation without a single confirmed casualty was simply another task completed rather than a battle survived. "They called it a message," I said quietly. "The Drathan commanders. They wanted to prove that peace with your people meant nothing when tested directly. They tested it," Daniel said, his voice carrying no satisfaction, no pride, only a tired kind of honesty. "Now they understand what testing it actually costs." I thought again of the old records buried in the colony archive, the pattern of factions that had made this exact mistake throughout human history, each one convinced that peace was a weakness to exploit rather than a boundary worth respecting. I wondered how many more factions across the galaxy still needed to learn that lesson before the pattern finally became common knowledge rather than a secret buried in forgotten files. "Will they try again?" I asked. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching the lights of the colony flicker below us, families returning to homes that had nearly been destroyed hours earlier, children being tucked into beds by parents who would likely never fully understand how close they had come to losing everything that evening. "Some will," he said finally. "Some people never learn until the lesson is repeated enough times to become impossible to ignore." I did not sleep again that night, lying awake beside a man who had just protected an entire colony, without raising his voice, without drawing obvious violence, without leaving behind the kind of visible wreckage that typically marked the end of a military engagement. I thought about the Drathan commander's flinch when I approached, the way his confidence had crumbled after 20 minutes of silence with my husband, the calm and unshaken way Daniel had described the entire encounter as simply asking people to reconsider their choices. I understood, lying there in the dark, that I had witnessed something far larger than a single skirmish resolved through unusual tactics. I had witnessed the quiet, patient demonstration of exactly why every faction that had ever broken peace with humanity had simply ceased to exist shortly afterward. Daniel Hart was not a weapon in the way my people typically understood weapons. He was something far more unsettling, a demonstration, a living answer to a question most civilizations were too afraid to ask directly: what happens when peace with humanity is broken? That night, For the first time since our wedding, I found myself grateful, rather than fearful, of the answer sleeping quietly beside me. In the days following the attack, my father summoned me to a private meeting, something he rarely did outside of official political functions. I arrived at his office, expecting questions about the colony's recovery, about diplomatic fallout with the Drathan ascendancy, about the political consequences of a hostage crisis resolved in ways nobody could fully explain to the public. Instead, he asked me about Daniel. "What do you know about your husband?" he asked, his voice carrying none of the careful political tone he usually reserved for matters of state. This was a father asking his daughter something he genuinely needed to understand. I considered how much to share, weighing loyalty to Daniel against loyalty to my own family, before settling on a version of the truth that felt honest without revealing everything I suspected. "I know he's not what we assumed when this marriage was arranged," I said carefully. "I know the treaty wasn't really about symbolic goodwill." My father studied me for a long moment, then reached into a drawer and slid a data file across his desk, its edges marked with security clearances I recognized as significantly above my own official access level. "This arrived from Dominion Intelligence this morning," he said, "requested after yesterday's incident. I want you to see it before deciding how much more you want to know." I opened the file slowly, uncertain whether I truly wanted the answers waiting inside it. What I found was fragmented, heavily redacted in places, clearly assembled from multiple sources that did not always agree with each other. But even through the gaps and blacked-out sections, a picture began forming that confirmed everything I had already started to suspect. Daniel Hart's service record did not read like a typical soldier's history. There were no standard deployment logs, no conventional unit assignments, no clear chain of command listed anywhere in the available documentation. Instead, scattered references appeared across multiple unrelated incidents throughout human territory, each one connected to conflicts that had ended far more quickly and quietly than military analysts expected. A border dispute 3 years earlier, resolved within a single week after escalating for months without progress. A pirate confederation dismantled entirely within days of taking human hostages, with no official record of how the operation succeeded. A rival faction's shipyard destroyed overnight following a diplomatic assassination, the official human military records simply noting the incident as resolved without further detail. Each entry connected, however loosely, to a single classified program referenced only by a partial designation. Something called the Continuance Initiative, described in one heavily redacted paragraph as a small group of specially trained individuals positioned within diplomatic and civilian roles across contested territories, tasked with response duties should peace agreements ever be violated by hostile parties. I read that paragraph 3 times before the full weight of it settled into my understanding. "He wasn't sent here as a symbolic gesture," I said quietly, more to myself than to my father. "He was sent here as insurance." My father nodded slowly, his expression carrying the same mixture of respect and unease I had begun to feel myself over the past several weeks. "Human diplomats never asked for land or resources after the war," he said. "They asked for a marriage instead. At the time, we believed we understood why. We assumed it was meant to symbolize trust, cooperation, the blending of two peoples working toward lasting peace. But that's not what it was," I finished for him. "No," he admitted. "I believe now it was meant as a demonstration. A quiet promise that any violation of the treaty would be answered directly, personally, without the need for a larger war that would cost countless lives on both sides." I thought about every moment since our wedding that had felt strange or unexplainable at the time. The scout ships that never crossed the border, the recruit who calmed instantly under Daniel's patient instruction, the smugglers who surrendered peacefully rather than facing violence they somehow understood was inevitable if they refused. The Drathan soldiers who fell silent one by one across 3 districts without a single confirmed casualty reported afterward. None of it had been random. None of it had been simple coincidence or unusual skill developed through ordinary training. Daniel Hart had been placed within my life, within my empire's territory, as a living deterrent against exactly the kind of violence that had nearly consumed our colony days earlier. "Does he know that we know?" I asked. "I imagine he assumes it's only a matter of time," my father said. "Men like him rarely stay hidden completely, especially not after an incident as public as yesterday's." I left my father's office that afternoon carrying a weight I had not expected to feel. Not fear, exactly, though traces of it remained. Something closer to a profound shift in how I understood my own marriage, my own husband, and the peace I had once believed was fragile and easily broken. I found Daniel later that evening in the colony's memorial garden, a quiet space set aside for reflection following the attack, where flowers had been planted in memory of those who might have died had the situation unfolded differently. He stood alone among the newly planted rows, his expression distant in a way I had not seen before. "I read your file today," I said, approaching slowly. "The parts my father was allowed to access, at least." He turned to face me, and for the first time since our wedding, I saw something close to vulnerability cross his features. Not fear, but a tired kind of resignation, like a man who had long expected this conversation and was relieved it had finally arrived. "I wondered how long it would take," he said quietly. "Is it true?" I asked. "The continuance initiative. Are you really meant to be some kind of living warning?" He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with the same careful precision he always used when discussing his past. "I'm meant to be an answer," he said finally, "to a question most people are too afraid to ask directly. What happens if peace with humanity is treated as weakness rather than respect? And the answer is you. The answer is people like me," he corrected gently, "scattered across contested territories, embedded within diplomatic arrangements, just like this one. Most of us never have to act. Most treaties hold without incident, and most of the people like me simply live quiet lives, raising families, building relationships, contributing to whatever community we've been placed within. But when a treaty breaks," I said, "then we respond," he said simply, quickly, quietly, without the need for a larger war that would cost far more lives on both sides than a single, targeted response ever could. I thought about the old records I had found weeks earlier, the pattern of factions across galactic history that had made the mistake of testing humanity's patience, each one disappearing shortly afterward without any of the dramatic warfare that history usually remembered. I understood now that those incidents were not evidence of humanity's overwhelming military might in any conventional sense. They were evidence of a system designed specifically to prevent large-scale warfare by responding to violations with precise, contained, devastating efficiency before conflicts could ever escalate into something larger. "Why marry me specifically?" I asked. "Why not simply station someone like you within our territory in a less personal role?" Daniel considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Marriage creates connection," he said. "It creates a reason to care about the outcome, beyond simple duty. I think the diplomats who designed this arrangement understood that someone protecting a place out of genuine relationship rather than pure obligation makes fewer mistakes and shows more restraint than someone acting purely out of assigned duty." "And do you," I asked quietly, "care about the outcome beyond duty, I mean?" He looked at me then with an intensity that had nothing to do with tactical calculation or careful diplomatic phrasing. Just simple, honest emotion, the kind I had been searching for since the day we first stood together at that altar with alarms blaring around us. "I didn't expect to," he admitted. "Not at first. I expected this to be exactly what everyone assumed it was, a diplomatic arrangement, a duty to fulfill professionally and quietly. I didn't expect to actually fall in love with the person I was assigned to protect." I felt something shift in my chest at his words, a warmth that pushed back gently against the fear and uncertainty that had been building since I first began uncovering the truth about who he really was. "I was afraid of you," I admitted. "For a long time. Maybe I still am. A little." "That's fair," he said. "I think you should be. At least a little. What I'm capable of isn't something anyone should feel entirely comfortable with." "But I'm not afraid of you the way I was before," I continued. "I'm afraid of what it would take to make you use that capability against people I care about. I'm afraid of losing you to a conflict that never should have happened in the first place." Daniel reached for my hand, holding it gently in a way that felt like an apology and a promise at the same time. "Then let's make sure that never happens," he said. "Let's make sure the peace holds long enough that nobody ever has to test what I'm truly capable of again." I stood with him in that quiet memorial garden, surrounded by flowers planted for tragedies that had nearly happened but ultimately did not, and felt something settle within me that I had been searching for since the day our marriage was first arranged. Not certainty exactly, not complete understanding of everything Daniel Hart was capable of, or everything the Continuance Initiative truly represented within the larger scope of human diplomatic strategy, but trust. Real, hard-earned trust, built not on the absence of fear, but on the choice to stand beside someone despite understanding exactly what they were capable of, and choosing to believe in the restraint they showed far more often than the power they rarely needed to use. That night, walking back to our quarters together, I understood that my marriage had never truly been about symbolic peace between two exhausted empires. It had been about something far more personal and far more binding than any treaty document could ever fully capture. I had married a quiet promise, and slowly, carefully, I had begun falling in love with the man who carried that promise every single day, choosing patience and restraint over the devastating alternative he was always fully capable of delivering instead. 3 months after the attack on our colony, the Velkari Dominion Council summoned me to testify before a closed session, the first time in my life I had been asked to speak formally on matters of state rather than simply attend as my father's daughter. Word of what had happened during the hostage crisis had spread quietly through diplomatic circles, and the council wanted answers about a husband most of them still did not fully understand. I stood before rows of skeptical faces, council members who had spent decades believing our empire held every advantage in any negotiation with younger, less established civilizations. I watched them shift uncomfortably as I explained what I had learned, careful to share only what my father and Daniel had agreed was appropriate for official record. The marriage was never simply a gesture of goodwill, I told them. It was a demonstration of restraint. Humanity showed us exactly what they were capable of by choosing not to use it, again and again, for months, until circumstances finally forced a response. One council member, an elder named Selin Dre, who had served through both wars against human colonies, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "You're asking us to believe that a single soldier dismantled an entire military operation without conventional weapons, without visible violence, simply through some undefined capability we're not permitted to understand." "I'm not asking you to believe anything," I said. "I'm telling you what I witnessed. The choice to accept it or dismiss it belongs to this council, not to me." Selin studied me for a long moment, then glanced toward my father, who remained silent throughout most of the session, allowing me to speak for myself in a way he rarely permitted during official matters. "And you're not afraid?" Selin asked, living alongside something so far beyond conventional understanding. I thought about that question longer than any other posed to me that day, remembering every moment since our wedding that had shaped my understanding of who Daniel truly was. The scout ships that never crossed the border, the recruit calmed by patient words rather than punishment, the smugglers who chose peaceful surrender over violence they somehow understood was inevitable otherwise, the Drathan commander whose confidence crumbled after 20 minutes of quiet conversation with a man who never once raised his voice. I was afraid, at first, I admitted honestly. I think fear was a reasonable response to something I didn't understand. But fear isn't what I feel anymore, standing here today. What do you feel instead? Selin asked. Gratitude, I said simply. Gratitude that the peace between our peoples is protected by someone who values restraint over power, patience over violence, and who chose, every single day since our wedding, not to use the capability he carries unless every other option had already failed completely. The council remained divided after my testimony, some members reassured by the demonstration of restraint I described, others deeply unsettled by the implication that human diplomatic strategy relied on capabilities far beyond anything our own military could match or fully comprehend. But the debate that followed, however contentious, never once suggested breaking the treaty or requesting a different arrangement. Whatever discomfort the council felt about the truth behind my marriage, none of them were willing to test the alternative directly. Word of the hostage crisis and its unusual resolution eventually spread beyond Velkhari and Drathan territory, reaching other contested regions along the edges of human expansion. Within months, quiet diplomatic inquiries began arriving from smaller factions and independent colonies, each one requesting information about how similar marriage arrangements might be established with human representatives of their own. My father found himself fielding requests from governments who had once viewed such treaties with suspicion, now suddenly eager to secure the same quiet protection my colony had received almost by accident. I found the shift strange to witness, watching skepticism transform gradually into genuine respect as more of the truth became understood across galactic diplomatic circles. Humanity had never needed to conquer territory or demonstrate overwhelming force to earn that respect. They had simply needed patience, restraint, and a willingness to let their actions speak clearly on the rare occasions when words alone proved insufficient. Daniel remained largely unaffected by the political attention surrounding our marriage, continuing his work, training local militia, and maintaining the quiet routines that had defined our life together since the wedding. I asked him once, during a quiet evening at home, how he felt about becoming something of a legend across contested territories he had never personally visited. "I don't think about it much," he said, setting aside the book he had been reading to look at me directly. "I'm not trying to be a legend, I'm just trying to make sure the people I care about are safe." "But other colonies are requesting arrangements just like ours now," I said. "Because of what happened here, because of what you did. Then I hope those arrangements never require the same kind of response," he said. "I hope every single one of them lives quietly, peacefully, without anyone ever needing to test what their protector is truly capable of." I understood, hearing him say that Daniel had never wanted recognition or reputation from the incident that had defined so much of our recent life together. He simply wanted the peace itself, the quiet, ordinary existence that violence had briefly interrupted before restraint and patience restored it once again. Life settled into something closer to normalcy in the months that followed, though normalcy now carried a different weight than it once had. I no longer watched Daniel with suspicion, searching for signs of hidden danger beneath his calm exterior. I watched him instead with the quiet appreciation of someone who understood exactly what she had, and chose gratitude over fear whenever memories of that chaotic evening resurfaced unexpectedly. We spent evenings together in ways that felt entirely ordinary despite everything I now knew about him. He taught me small things about human culture that I had never bothered learning before our marriage, simple recipes passed down through generations of his family, songs that meant something personal to him, though I could not always understand the context behind the lyrics. I taught him things about Velkhari traditions in return, small rituals tied to seasons and harvests that had nothing to do with politics or diplomacy, simply the quiet culture of a people learning to share their lives more honestly with each other. One evening, nearly a year after our wedding, I found him in our small kitchen preparing tea, the way he always did, methodical and careful even in something as simple as steeping leaves in hot water. I watched him from the doorway for a long moment, remembering the first night of our marriage when I had studied him with suspicion, searching for reasons to distrust a stranger my empire had forced into my life. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, noticing my quiet observation without turning around. "The first night we were married," I said. "I watched you sleep, trying to figure out what kind of danger I had actually agreed to live with." He smiled slightly, pouring 2 cups and carrying them toward the small table where we usually shared quiet moments like this one. "And what have you decided, after all this time?" I considered the question seriously, thinking about everything that had happened since that chaotic wedding day. The scout ships and hostage crisis, the archive records revealing patterns I never expected to find, the council testimony where I chose honesty over fear, the quiet respect that had gradually replaced suspicion in the way my own people spoke about my husband. "I've decided I married exactly the right kind of danger," I said finally, "the kind that only ever appears when peace has already failed, and chooses every single day not to let that failure happen in the first place." Daniel reached across the table, taking my hand gently the way he had in that memorial garden months earlier, when honesty between us first began replacing the careful distance we had maintained since our wedding. "I think that's the best description anyone's ever given me," he said softly. "Better than anything in my official file, certainly." We sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, sipping tea in a quiet home that had nearly become a battlefield once, now settled instead into something closer to genuine partnership than either of us had expected when this marriage was first arranged as a political solution to an exhausted war. I thought sometimes, in quiet moments like these, about the empty battlefield reports I had read in my father's classified file, the fleets and garrisons that had simply ceased to exist after testing humanity's patience too directly. I thought about how strange it was that such devastating capability could exist alongside such gentle, patient restraint, housed within the same quiet man who currently sat across from me, discussing nothing more dramatic than which tea he preferred for evening conversations. But mostly, I thought about gratitude. Gratitude for a peace that had held, fragile as it once seemed, protected not through overwhelming military force paraded publicly for intimidation, but through quiet restraint exercised daily by someone who understood that true strength meant choosing patience whenever patience remained a viable option. The Drathan ascendancy never attempted another direct provocation after that hostage crisis, their diplomatic relationship with our colony settling into a wary but genuine respect that neither side had expected to develop. Other factions across contested territories learned similar lessons through careful diplomatic channels rather than direct confrontation, understanding gradually that testing humanity's patience carried consequences far more severe and far more immediate than any conventional military response could match. I never stopped being aware of what Daniel was truly capable of, the quiet, devastating efficiency he had demonstrated only once, during those 20 minutes when an entire hostile operation collapsed silently around him. But awareness had transformed slowly into something closer to appreciation, understanding that the peace protecting my colony, my people, and my own quiet domestic life depended entirely on his continued choice to exercise restraint rather than power. Some nights, lying beside him in the comfortable silence that had replaced my early suspicion, I found myself grateful for a political marriage that had somehow, unexpectedly, become something far more genuine than either empire had originally intended. I had been given a husband to secure peace between exhausted civilizations. I had received, instead, a partner who valued that peace as deeply as I did, protecting it quietly, patiently, and completely, without ever needing recognition or reward for the restraint he showed every single day. I married a human for peace, expecting a political arrangement built on obligation rather than genuine connection. I watched him demonstrate, quietly and without fanfare, exactly what protecting that peace truly required. And somewhere along the way, without either of us fully intending it, I fell in love with the quiet, patient man who chose every single day to be the answer to violence rather than the cause of it. That, I have come to understand, was always the truest purpose behind our marriage. Not simply ending a war between two exhausted empires, but demonstrating, through patient example rather than public spectacle, exactly what genuine peace could look like when protected by someone who understood both the terrible cost of power and the quiet, deliberate choice to use it only when every other option had already failed completely.